You close the bathroom door and turn the lock. For a few minutes, nobody can see you. Nobody can hear you. You get to just sit with your own thoughts, completely unobserved. It feels ordinary. It barely registers as a moment at all. But for almost the entire span of human existence, that click of a lock didn't exist. Doors, in the way you think of them, didn't exist. Walls, for most of that time, barely existed either. For roughly 300,000 years, being truly alone was rare. When it happened, it usually meant something had gone wrong, not right. Privacy, at its core, is really just the ability to control what other people can see, hear, or know about you. A switch you can flip on whenever you want. For most of the story of your species, that switch did not exist. So how did an entire species function like that? Not just survive physically. Stay sane. In 1963, an anthropologist named Richard Lee traveled into the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa to live alongside a community of hunter-gatherers, people who fed themselves entirely by gathering wild plants and hunting animals, with no farms and no permanent homes. They were part of a group known as the hoansi, sometimes called the Kungsan. What Lee found first surprised him. These were not people scraping by every waking hour just to eat. Many weeks they spent less than 20 hours gathering enough food to feed everyone. What surprised him just as much was something quieter. Nobody in the camp was ever really alone, and nobody seemed to expect to be. A camp here wasn't a house with rooms down a hallway. It was a loose ring of small huts, often just bent branches layered with grass, spaced closely enough that you could hear a neighbor cough at night, or a baby fuss 2 huts over. The huts usually faced inward, toward a shared central fire. That meant the front of your home was never really private either. It faced the rest of the group by design. There were no bedrooms. There were no bathroom doors. There was no real equivalent of, I just need a minute alone. Decades later, anthropologist James Suzman lived among the descendants of these same communities in Namibia and described daily life in almost identical terms. Eating happened in the open, in view of whoever was around. Childcare happened in the open too, often shared among several adults at once, so a baby might nurse from one woman and be carried by another an hour later. Even disagreements played out in the open because there was no private room to take them into. Anthropologists sometimes call this pattern cooperative caregiving. More eyes on every child meant a child was rarely unsupervised and rarely unsafe. It also meant a child was rarely, if ever, unseen. Why would a species build its entire existence around never being alone? Part of the answer shows up after dark. Anthropologist Polly Wiessner spent years recording and studying conversations among the hoansi, and she noticed something specific about how talk changed with the sun. Daytime conversation was practical. People discussed food, resolved small disputes, occasionally complained about who wasn't pulling their weight. Nighttime conversation, gathered around the fire, was something else entirely. That was where people told stories. Long, personal, emotional stories about love, loss, ancestors, the spirit world. And they told them in front of everyone who was there to listen. There was no diary for processing a hard day alone. No private journal. No closed door to cry behind. If something significant happened to you, the group eventually heard about it, usually straight from you. At that same fire, in front of everyone you'd ever known. This wasn't a lack of options. It was how the whole system was built to work. Evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar has spent decades studying the size of human social groups, and one of his best-known ideas now has a name: Dunbar's number. It suggests the human brain can only maintain genuinely close, trusting relationships with roughly 150 people, and far fewer than that with any real depth. Dunbar has also argued that gossip, so often dismissed as trivial, likely evolved as a serious social tool. In a group too large to watch every single person every second, talking about each other was how reputations got tracked and bad behavior got caught early. Most hunter-gatherer bands never even approached that number. They typically held 20 to 50 people total, which means everyone already knew everyone. There was no crowd to vanish into, no stranger to perform for, no version of yourself you could present differently to different people, because the same group saw you every day, in every context, for your entire life. The physical evidence lines up with this picture. At a site called Ohalo 2 on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, archaeologists uncovered the remains of brush huts more than 23,000 years old, among the oldest dwelling structures ever found. They weren't divided into rooms. Each was a single open space, built to hold an entire family under one curved roof, together. So picture a single day inside a life like that. You wake up because someone near you stirs first. Maybe your mother, already awake, already nursing your younger sibling a few feet from where you slept. You can hear someone clearing their throat outside, someone else stacking wood. Breakfast, when there's food ready, gets eaten sitting in a loose half circle, because that's simply where everyone already happens to be. If you need to relieve yourself, you walk to the edge of the camp. Not out of shame. It's simply where it's done, and people nearby might notice, and nobody mentions it either way. If you wash in the same river the rest of the camp uses, sometimes at the very same time as everyone else. If you happen to be falling for someone else in camp, the whole group likely knew before you ever said it out loud. There was no real version of a secret relationship. Not for long, anyway. At night, bodies sleep close together, sometimes touching. Partly for warmth, since a single fire only pushes the cold back so far. Partly because more bodies means more ears listening for movement in the dark, in a world that still had large predators in it. A lone sleeper was a vulnerable sleeper, in more ways than one. Even the heaviest moments a person could carry, sickness, grief, fear, happened close enough that someone else could sense it, even if they weren't watching directly. What would that do to a person, never once having a fully private moment from birth to death? Here's the part that seems backward at first. You might assume a life with zero privacy sounds unbearable. But for your ancestors, that constant visibility wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system. If everyone could see how much food you brought back, nobody could quietly take more than their share. If everyone heard your stories, nobody could quietly rewrite their own past. If everyone slept close enough to notice a fever rising overnight, nobody slipped away unnoticed from something that started small. Total visibility built total trust, because there was almost nothing left to hide, and very little reason to try. It also meant almost nobody fell through the cracks. If you got sick, 20 or 30 people already knew you're normal, and could tell within a day that something was wrong. A struggle rarely stayed hidden long enough to quietly become a crisis. Privacy, the version you live with now, is a surprisingly recent invention. Historians who study the history of housing point out that separate bedrooms for individual family members only became common in the last few centuries, and initially, only among people wealthy enough to afford the extra walls. For most of human history, across most cultures, sleeping, eating, even dying happened in shared space, in full view of the people who loved you. Even in wealthy nations, whole families sharing one main room, or several children sharing a single bed, was still completely ordinary within roughly the last 100 years. So what actually changed? Walls got cheaper to build. Cities got bigger and more crowded with strangers. Being surrounded by people you didn't know, instead of people who'd known you your whole life, slowly became normal. And somewhere in that shift, being alone stopped being a strange, uneasy exception and started becoming something people actively wanted. Today you can spend an entire day without a single person checking on you. You can go weeks maintaining hundreds of online connections while barely speaking to another human face to face. You might have more followers than your ancestors ever had people in their entire lives and still feel less truly known by any single one of them. Public health officials have started describing chronic loneliness as one of the defining health issues of modern life, not because people lack privacy, but because many now have more solitude than a human brain evolved to handle well. Your brain still runs on much older wiring than your bedroom door suggests. It still expects a small, tight circle of people who see almost everything about you, the way your ancestors' entire camp once did, automatically, without anyone asking for it. Most people today could name only a handful of people who actually know them that closely. For most of human history, that number was closer to everyone you'd ever met in your life. That closeness wasn't something your ancestors had to build on purpose. It came standard, whether they wanted it or not. You still have a door. You still have a lock. That part isn't going anywhere, and it shouldn't have to. But tonight, when you close that door and finally exhale, alone, it might be worth noticing the thing your ancestors never had to wonder about at all. Whether there's still someone out there who actually knows what's going on with you.